Okay, let us start session 5, non-traditional security issues. I feel a bit sorry for the presenters in the previous session because they didn't get any comments. And maybe on the corridor I heard some discussions, so that's good. And well, the topic, non-traditional security issues. To be frank, I'm not quite sure why I was asked to chair this session because I'm not necessarily strong on these issues. And there was nobody, so I will try my best to make discussions as fruitful as possible for the young presenters. That should be the goal of this entire endeavor, funded by the Japan Foundation. And so, well, non-traditional security issues. I saw one possible underlying sort of theoretical sort of conflict between different presentations. And, well, this has to do with the concept of securitization. And the so-called Copenhagen School of Thought on this issue is very, very, very popular. And the last presentation somewhat challenges this. And so there should be interesting discussions and debate between somewhat traditional approach to non-security issues after the end of the Cold War, which has become a bit of boom for a certain period of time. And but as the kind of traditional security concerns come back as sort of critical issues, there was some discussions and debates about this original emphasis on the importance of non-traditional security issues, and it's an ongoing debate, I'm pretty sure. And so this, as I saw just abstracts of the three presentations, this could be one underlying sort of theme for this session. But of course, presentations doesn't have to be constrained by my observation of this. But because time is very much limited, I will try my best to make the session, well, not to extend too much, but we might a little bit. But I hope you would understand. And so I would like, according to the order written in the program, I would like to start with. Sorry for my mispronunciation. And Chatterjee, is that okay? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Before I begin today, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for giving me this opportunity, because as a college student, this is not something that a lot of us expect or we achieve. So I'm really looking forward to providing my initial insights onto Japan's migration policies and situate it within the overall rubric of the Indo-Pacific vision. My special thanks also goes to Mr. Sanjay Pulipaka for encouraging me to present at this conference. And I'm looking forward to constructive evaluations from my peers and seniors after this. Without further ado, we shall begin.
Sorry, I forgot to mention, if you could restrict yourself up 15 minutes maximum,
sure.
I would appreciate. Yeah, presenters.
The topic for today is the alternative insights, Japan's refugee policy versus its Indo-Pacific goals. I'll briefly go over the themes that I'll be touching upon today. Firstly, I'll contextualize Japan's refugee policy with respect to its Indo-Pacific visions. This is to show to the audience a dichotomy between its traditional and non-traditional security issues. Secondly, I will talk about the trends in migration to Japan. We shall see historically under the Tokugawa shogunate and in the Meiji era, and how it has transpired in recent times. Thirdly, we'll move on to a brief discussion on Japanese society, and then we'll talk about statelessness in Japan, and finally we shall review government organs and the role of civil society in Japan and how they can better the scenario. So on the first theme, Japan historically under the Tokugawa shogunate experienced sakoku, or a self-imposed isolation. This means that Japan encouraged probably a foreign transfer of ideas, but they did not really encourage a presence of foreigners in their native lands. And this similar rhetoric of fear continued in the Meiji era as well. Thereafter, this rhetoric of fear of the presence of foreigners continues thereafter, and then we have the World War II and the signing of the Refugee Convention by the Japanese, following the footsteps of America, really looking up to the US's economic restructuring and hoping that in case of following the American model, they shall also achieve similar goals. Thereafter, Japan faces the problem of the influx of Indo-Chinese refugees, and particularly Japan is chosen as a destination point because of the Asian character of Japanese society, which seems fairly attractive to these refugees. So Japan goes on to provide rescue efforts to protect Laos, Cambodians, and Vietnamese who were being forced to migrate. But what we see is they were hesitant to let them settle within Japan. And we see similar trends where Japan is an important donor, providing $1 billion sterling to counter the Middle Eastern refugee crisis, and in fact even developing places like Serbia and Macedonia as transit zones, and conducting peace-building activities in Lebanon. But at the same time, its domestic policies seem very restrictive. This, we believe, is that the Ministry of Justice in Japan considers that there is the potential threat that existing nationals in Japan, that the Taiwanese, Koreans, might demand long-term immigration status and other benefits which are not currently provided to them. And secondly, there's also an existing pressure from, at that time, there was an existing pressure from the UNHCR to grant permanent residency status to Indo-Chinese refugees along with other benefits like public housing and insurance. But such benefits, again, were not being granted to foreign minorities already residing in Japan at that time. In conclusion, we can see that historically Japan's migration policy has been guided by the threat of international censorship, domestic criticism, and international political dynamics. So currently it is important to note that the fear of a hegemonic rise of China and the possibility of a united front with the United States, with Korea, and the larger Indo-Pacific goal might guide the future trends in Japan's migration policy. Now, the centrality to Japanese society is the idea of Nihon Jinrin. It is defined by Rotem Kauner as a unique and unparalleled product of racial and historical and climatic elements that underlie the essence of current social phenomena. So it essentially means that people who are adequately Japanese will only be able to understand the essence of a Japanese culture. We shall tie this to the essence of the Japanese nationality law, which essentially highlights two features. First is the idea of homogeneity, which says that only people who share common notions of language, religion, lifestyle, and belonging to the same race will be accorded a nationality status. And secondly, the second premise, which is most important to our discussion, is a strong correlation between the land of Japan, its people, and its culture. Therefore, the nature of Japanese society can be inherited and understood only by Japanese people. The nationality law is based on the right of blood, and so it means that equal freedom is accorded to only those people who are adequately Japanese. Therefore, what we see is even assimilated foreigners who have been living there for over 2 generations, but without any dominant cultural affiliations, would face the risk of discrimination. I believe that in the absence, in my scope of limited research, I believe that in the absence of any other dominant intellectual cultural reasoning, Nihon Jinrin guides and directs political establishment and the economic elite currently in Japan, and it must be central to all our discussions on the nationality issue in Japan. To briefly look at the impact of Nihon Jinrin in the Japanese society currently, we see that the older generation or the war generation group has the tendency to adhere to this principle. It is natural that this, and it is very similar to India and any other country, where the glorification of the past by these traditional orders is a way of sort of reaffirming faith in one's country. So so people with less foreign association and those who are less educated will probably more confidently adhere to the principles of Nihon Jinrin. In the face of international competition and economic depression, there is a risk of reverting to old traditional views, and the Japanese bureaucracy and ruling parties seem to be bound in such insecurities currently. We will briefly discuss statelessness, the nature of statelessness in Japan. There are theoretically, there are two kinds of statelessness. One is de jure statelessness and the other de facto, and I shall be dealing with the first kind. So de jure statelessness is a situation where a given person is not considered a national by any state under the operation of state laws. The dominant minority groups who currently do not experience the benefits of being granted a nationality status are the Koreans and Brazilians in Japan currently. We will look at these two case studies individually. So coming to the Koreans, we can trace it back to the colonial takeover of Korea by Japan, and these were mainly the migrants comprise mainly economic migrants and prisoners of war. After the war, their citizenship was stripped off in 1952, and therefore the second generation Koreans living in Japan currently face numerous problems. So they do not identify with being Korean at all, having lived in Japan for over 2 generations, and they do not. And Japan refuses to grant them the similar benefits of that general native nationalities get than the Koreans do. There is also a tension with the DPRK, which has been highlighted by several speakers before this. There is the problem of abductions on the borderlines of Japan, and these abductions are feared to have been conducted by North Korean agents. So, but at most of the times, there are several boat people who are compelled to flee the deplorable situation in North Korea right now. And however, on entry into Japan, they are generalized as spies and as a threat to national security. However, it is interesting to note that several repatriates also travel from North Korea back to Japan. These repatriates probably traveled to North Korea during World War II to provide expertise. But now when they are coming back and gaining entry into Japan, these diplomatic missions are unheralded by the media, which is interesting to see that the same influx of people from a same region has a different approach as far as the Japanese are concerned. This shows us that the representation by the media plays an important role in forming our perception about migrants and who is a legal or an illegal immigrant. The Japanese, if I might call it, the admiration of America, or sort of historically basing their economic development on America and believing that that model might be the best step forward, has also shaped the way that media portrays the Japanese Brazilians living in Japan currently. So the foreign nationals of Japanese Brazilians are essentially foreign nationals of a Japanese ancestry who are eligible for long-term residence and employment in unskilled labor. However, the prejudice against these anomalies have subsided. Therefore, we see in Japan that statelessness is guided by a sense of hierarchization, and it is an interesting phenomenon to record. Central to a discussion on the theme of migration is also the role that is played by governmental organization and civil society in ensuring a safe haven for these foreign nationals living in a particular region. The ideal role that can be played by non-state actors in this situation is providing social learning about refugees, a compliance to international norms, and thus creating a transnational network. And finally, it is the burden on part of these non-state actors measures to show how international norms are in consonance with state interests. However, we see that the UNHCR has failed to socialize the Japanese state to view refugee protection as serving the state's interest, and it demands rectification. There are certain other problems that I will highlight as far as civil society is concerned in Japan. Firstly, there is a lack of transparency in these governmental organs, as we see in the Kazan Kiran case. To briefly go over what this case was, a Kurdish family from Turkey who migrated to Japan in 1995 were forcibly deported, and they faced the fear of persecution in Turkey at that time, and yet the Japanese did not really provide concrete reasoning as to why they were being deported back to Turkey, and it caused great reaction from the international community. There are several generalization that is a problem in these governmental organizations, which is permanent visas are rejected on the ground of lack of relevant documents. But these governments fail to recognize that not all migrants are economic migrants, and on certain cases of forcible migration, such documents are lost. There's a problem in rehabilitation and assimilation of these refugees as well. The Japan's Technical Intern Training Program, or the TITP, was aimed at providing refugees from less developed countries skill development in construction, agriculture, manufacture, healthcare for up to 5 years, skills that would best integrate them. However, what goes unnoticed is the conditions of work, the forced labor conditions, and their passports at times are also seized, among numerous cases of human rights violations. There's a lack of, I'll be just wrapping up. So to just briefly go over the other problems, there's also a lack of an independent channel, because cases of deportation decided by the Ministry of Justice can only be appealed to the very same body which decides on such deportation. Also, there is a need for an unbiased body to determine the situation of the DPRK refugees, who are seen as an agenda of the right, and therefore it lessens engagement with them. So a wide range of civil society groups with diverse approaches and perspectives will probably make the situation more constructive and will decrease the vulnerability that these groups face. To briefly sum up today's discussion, we saw how Japan's multilateral foreign policy sort of contradicts its own guarded domestic policies with regard to migrant communities. So as far as what we've seen in this conference, as far as the traditional sector is concerned, there is a lot of openness and a lot of freeness that we talk about. But as far as accepting foreign nationals and creating a safe haven for foreign minorities in its country, Japan does have a very guarded domestic policy. We saw the problems of adjustment and assimilation and evaluated whether there is a possibility of multiculturalism in Japan, and whether Japan can benefit from this. Demographically, currently being on the back foot, it can be taken, the influx of refugees can be taken advantage of, and it is a scope for Japan to gain international applause. And so thank you.
Thank you very much. If I may, can I ask you
Sure.
2 questions?
Yeah.
One is you are third-year undergraduate students.
Yes.
Yeah. What made you apply for this?
So.
Or what's your future career sort of plan? Do you want to be a scholar or?
So I want to carry forward further research in the area of migration and forced migration and refugee and formation of diasporas. So
in general?
Yes. So, and regionally, why I was interested in Japan is my research has always focused on the conventional influx of refugees from West Asia to the world, and thereafter, when I was looking at migratory patterns in different parts of the world, and prompted in fact by Mr. Sanjay Polipaka, I came across interesting material, and this dichotomy really interested me.
I see. So you want to go to graduate school?
Yes.
And you picked up the Japan case because this is the Japan Forum?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And secondly, what were the sources that you used for your presentation?
it's obviously, I mean, there are certain obvious limitations that I've faced where I do not understand the Japanese language, and neither have I ever visited Japan. So I based my research completely on secondary material, and these were books. And I mean, my college library at St. Stephen's College in Delhi, I mean, we have an East Asian wing where it was very easy to come across, I mean, secondary source material.
So mostly English material.
Mostly English material.
Written by
English scholars and some Japanese scholars as well. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And so let us move on to the second presentation, climate change, impact of climate change on migration. Rania Sarkar, is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me in the beginning thank the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library as well as the Japan Foundation, New Delhi, for co-organizing this stimulating conference along with the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. In particular, I would like to thank Mr. Shakti Sinha ji and also Mr. Sanjay Pulipaka in particular for giving me the opportunity to present my paper here. So coming to the topic of my presentation, I would be talking about the impact of climate change on migration. And in particular, I would be dealing with select cases in the Indo-Pacific region, such as the Maldives in the Indian Ocean and the small island countries, particularly in the South Pacific Oceans. And of course, there are other countries like Bangladesh, Philippines, etc., which are facing similar issues of migration as an effect of environmental change and degradation. But these would come up in my presentation as small examples only due to the paucity of time. And I would wind up by talking about some of the efforts and initiatives that have come up for addressing these challenges, and also some few recommendations. So, to introduce, everybody knows what climate change is. It is not a new phenomenon. It has become cliched to talk about what it is and how and why it occurs. It is now a household term. So, and we have glaring evident effects of numerous frequent natural catastrophes with which explicitly talk about the vulnerability of human race and living beings in general. And it is, of course, not limited to any particular geographical territory, and as the effects of climate change is borne by one and all. But in particular, however, the low-income developing countries are the ones which are mostly affected. And there's a very much close link to the increasing number of natural disasters and environmental catastrophes with regards to climate change. Coming to migration, forced migration or human displacement, it is a familiar way out for individuals facing adverse situations like political, economic, and even climatic. So, when we come to the climate change-induced migrations, there can be two types. First, there can be internal climate migration, which happens within the country. And as an example, the International Organization for Migration did a study on Bangladesh in 2017. It found that influences impacting agriculture-based and aquaculture-based livelihoods in Bangladesh, like floods, droughts, excessive rain and salinity intrusion, and tropical cyclones, they contributed to migration, and around 60% of the respondents migrated internally, mostly towards Dhaka, the capital city. And of course, we also have the second type is cross-border climate migration, which happens across national borders of countries. Now, how is climate change and forced migration related? So climate change is seen as a driver of migration. It is rarely a direct trigger for human displacement, but it is of course a threat multiplier. And rather it intensifies, climate change intensifies the consequences of underlying environmental, social and governance challenges to reduce resilience, therefore driving people to move and exposing them to increased risks of displacement. There can be disasters, as I was talking about disasters, there can be various forms of disasters displacing large masses, and many of these forms of disasters that lead to forced migration are linked to climate change. And we can talk about two types, like sudden onset disasters like cyclones, where they can immediately displace people. But in that case, migration cannot necessarily be permanent. They might come back as well. Then we have slow onset disasters like sea level rise and drought, which can slowly displace people, but and leading to preemptive migration or planned relocations. There are two schools of thought within scholars who have viewed migration and climate change very differently through a positive lens as well as a negative lens. So scholars working in the area of climate change impacts, they view migration as a negative through a negative lens, and scholars working on migration view migration as a much more positive outcome. And there was a global report on internal displacement which said in 2016 almost 24.2 million people were newly displaced due to sudden onset disasters alone, which is more than three times the number of people displaced by conflict in the same year. Most of these disasters were climate related and weather related, and 2/3 of this displacement occurred only in East Asia and the Pacific. There can be other associated issues of conflict and security, talking about economic migration, where international migration happens because of diversification of livelihoods. We can take the case of Philippines, where declining rice production linked to climate variations in certain areas correlated with increased international migrations, especially among women. There can be there's a possibility of the loss of whole territories with potential loss of statehood, and we'll come to I'll come to this when I am talking about the low-lying small island states. Again, climate change can also exacerbate a conflict situation as a threat multiplier where situations are already volatile. And also small issues like though not small, but increased cases of human trafficking and smuggling have been also reported, specifically in Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan, and Bangladesh cyclones Sidr and Ayla. And also there have been cases of smuggling of drought-affected migrants from Cambodia to Thailand. Additionally, people might be abroad during disasters at home countries. Also, migrants might be affected in disasters in their transit countries. So coming to Maldives, which is an archipelago of 26 coral atolls in the Indian Ocean, it is almost like more than 99% of the total land area in Maldives is occupied by water. And only remaining 0.33% is the land territory. And the total area of Maldives, it's almost equivalent to the usual area of a single middle-sized western city. And 80% of the area is 1 meter or less above sea level. And so out of the total of 1,190 coral islands, only 202 are inhabited. And even within those 202 islands, already 14 islands are uninhabitable already due to climate change. And there's prediction that the whole there's a prediction of loss of whole territories with potential loss of statehood. Maldives, I took up the case of Maldives tourism industry because it is a very, very popular tourism destination. And the economy, talking about tourism industry, in the economy, more than 22.7% of GDP in Maldives is contributed by the tourism industry, and around 70% of foreign exchange earnings come from them. And then moving on to the South Pacific island countries, there are three major areas: Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. This is the most disaster-prone region in the world, I would say, with almost like 539 plus and more than 539 disasters that happened between 1970 and 2014 with cyclones and droughts, etc., across these countries. According to the World Bank, between 1950 and 2011, there were extreme weather-related events in the region which affected 9.2 million people approximately, and the damage estimated was around US dollars 3.2 billion. And there's a significant amount of aid coming from regional players in the small island states, talking about particularly Australia, approximately 1,138.4 million Australian dollars. China also plays a role as a aid in the terms of aid. China provides approximately 1,800 million US dollars of aid in bilateral aid across 218 projects between 2006 and 2014. So what are the global efforts? Talking about the efforts and initiatives, globally, the UNFCCC migration was integrated first into UNFCCC in 2010 through the Cancun Adaptation Framework. Next, we have the Sendai Framework. It is a non-binding agreement which recognizes displacement as a major impact of disasters. The Agenda for Protection of Cross-Border Displaced Persons, which came up in October 2015, talk about climate-related displacement. In addition to these, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which talks about climate-induced migration as well. Particularly in the Pacific Island countries, there is framework for Pacific regionalism as well as the framework for resilient development in the Pacific. Both of these documents have already incorporated climate-induced migration as a threat, as a topic which needs immediate action. And talking about the regional network, ASEAN Community Vision 2025 also prioritizes disaster risk reduction and response to climate change and the protection of migrant workers. And so I would like to wind up with some recommendations. Number one, there's a worldwide collaborative endeavor that is necessary to avert the worst effect of climate change. Yes, a lot of it is happening, but we need to move also from there. Secondly, it needs to be ensured that climate change is researched. It's researched as an issue of human security and subsequently integrated into human rights frameworks, including the Resolution 1325 of the United Nations. It is also important to make sure that climate change affected communities are included in peace and security policy dialogues and negotiations. We need to move forward in this domain particularly. International organizations should also mandate peacekeeping operations where appropriate to monitor natural resources or environmental matters that have the potential to trigger conflict. And I want to end with the positive note that climate change threats can provide an opportunity to strengthen regional security forums and engagement, adding to areas of cooperation. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I think we have long talked about, climate change as one of the major so-called non-traditional security issues after the end of the Cold War. And on the other hand, migration has also, it's a rather recent sort of topic of attention. And I think the unique aspect of this presentation was, because I'm not a specialist, this may not be unique in your field, but if that's the case, please correct me. I thought it was somewhat unique to combine, 2 or 3 different, issues of non-traditional. So climate change, its impact upon migration. So as a combination, this could be treated as a sort of set, right? And I think is it unique approach or is it not necessarily in your field?
If not unique, it's very new.
Very new.
In terms of all these, I was talking about all the global endeavors that have come up. It's very new.
I see. Okay. So I think this is encouraging intellectual trend. For us to realize the kind of importance of these issues. Some people, climate change, yes, but how this can be a security issue. Those kind of have already been there, right? And so this kind of new approach, I think, I thought would be an interesting sort of new framework to deal with these issues. Yeah. Okay, so lastly, maybe I don't have to try to. Relatively easy. No. Oh, it's long. Mr. Sidar.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
He has some theoretical approach to this issue, to these issues. So I look forward to hearing you. Yeah, please.
So let me start off by thanking Mr. Sanjay Pulipaka and Mr. Shakti Sinha, as well as members of Japan Foundation and ICRIER for organizing this conference. So the title of my presentation is Desecuritizing Migration in the Indo-Pacific. And basically, I will be going through it in the following structure. First, I'll define the scope. Then I'll present the issue, go through the background and the trends in the area. After which, I will be conceptualizing migration security nexus through different schools of thought, then critique those schools of thought and provide a different perspective. So, in terms of geography, the scope includes the movements only in Southeast Asia, East Asia and the Pacific. The reason why South Asia is left out of the scope is because there's a lot of scholarship already present in it, and it might get repetitive if I work on the same area. In terms of migration, the definition of migration is taken from the International Organization on Migration, which defines migration as complex population movements, including refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and other migrants. And other migrants would include minors or smuggled persons, victims of trafficking, or stranded migrants. The reason why I've chosen this definition is because it's broad in scope as compared to UNHRC definition and other definitions which are there. Security, I will be looking at security through the lens of critical security studies approach, which, according to which security is a practice or a frame of domination and or exclusion, wherein different sites, discourses, agencies, technologies are involved. So, the issue, basically, as I said before, the nexus between migration and security has been formed by different schools of thought. But a politico-sociological approach to migration security nexus can be developed by analyzing the effects that the political framing of migration as a threat has on public perception as well as policymakers. So in this regard, articulation of knowledge, discourse, technology or practices in certain manner would help us understand how stronger actions against migration has been legitimized. So you can draw a correlation with the white man's burden, wherein the colonial masters use this pretense to rule over most of the world. So in terms of migration again, when you produce a continuous and intensive circulation of discourses, wherein migration is referred to as flood or irregular, or you say that migrants have health issues and if they come into our borders, we're going to get infected. So this paper sees how these kind of articulations has hidden a few facts which are not seen in other theories. So basically, three broad themes would be analyzed: how states use discourses, how smugglers and how there's a power-knowledge dichotomy in smugglers and traffickers, and the issue of labor migration. So the background, Indo-Pacific is basically, it's a diverse, vast and complex region. And according to the United Nations Economic and Social Affairs Division, this region hosted around 53 million migrants in 2005. And the remittances in 2016 were $233 billion. And in 2017 it was 247 billion. The estimates are given by the World Bank. The sad part in this area is that 25 out of 45 states have signed the Refugee Convention, which shows that states are reluctant to uphold their human rights obligations under international human rights law. moving on to the trends. The trends in the Indo-Pacific is not only movements from global north to south or from south to north. The migration trends happen across southern global south as well. The primary driver from migration is income inequality and demography. So low skill labor migration happens only on a temporary basis, but if a highly skilled migrant wants to settle in a different country, he is welcome. So the trend in Indo-Pacific is that we have a lot of low skilled labor migration taking place, which is not welcome by most countries. And other two reasons why migration happens is because of natural disasters as well as conflicts. Okay, so conceptualizing migration security nexus. So in this section, I'll be dealing with different theories. Specifically, I will deal with realism, liberalism, securitization, as well as the human security approach. So basically, realists, as everybody knows, they believe that international structure is made up of anarchy, where states states rely on a self-help system, in order to protect their sovereignty as well as their borders. So, under this context, Samuel Huntington warns the U.S. that the single most immediate and serious challenge to America's traditional security are the Mexicans who are coming into America illegally. Similarly, Fiona Adamson says that international migration affects state sovereignty, the balance of power among states, and the nature of violent conflicts. Another dimension which realists deal with is the nature of conflict or violence which takes place. And specifically in this regard, Khalid Kosher his talk on breaking the cycle of radicalization is very important, because he brings in the nexus between how migrants have been radicalized in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, where the numbers are very high. So people from these countries have gone to Syria to join the ISIS to fight against the liberal order. Speaking of liberal order, next are the liberals. They believe in individual liberty, free market economy, and free movement of labor. So an important scholar in this regard is G.P. Freeman. He applies the client politics theory to understand why states should help migrants. So under this theory, client politics is a type of politics when an organized minority or interest group benefits at the expense of the public at large. And so basically he says that the larger public has to take care of the people who are coming into our borders, and this is based on a Kantian cosmopolitan approach, where by mere fact of us and them being human beings, we need to help each other. So the next school of thought is Copenhagen school of thought. This is the most widely used school of thought, and it's also called creative, and it's also supposed to be a very analytical framework to deal with, to securitize issues. So basically, securitization is a process wherein an issue is presented as an existential threat which requires immediate and urgent measures to mitigate or curtail. So in this process, basically an issue such as migration is presented to an audience by a way of speech act. So when you present migration as a security threat, certain actions need to be taken. So actions are taken on 3 levels: at the level of the state, at the level of regional or international security, and at the level of the individual. State's national security. So in this section, I map out the policies of 3 governments: Australia, Indonesia, and China. So let's start with Australia. Australia came up with a policy called Operation Sovereign Borders in 2013. So the government implemented this formula by putting Australian defense forces in charge of asylum operations. So basically what happened, guards were basically waiting for people who used to come by boats, and they used to either send them back or not let them enter Australian waters at all. So this is a perfect manifestation of how migration has been securitized in the true sense. You are sending your army and not letting anybody come inside your state, which is basically controlling the movement of people. Also, Australia's policy is so strict that they have also set up offshore facilities in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. So, illegal migrants or irregular migrants who enter Australia have been sent to these facilities where the conditions are poor, and the hope of these victims reaching their home is close to nil. People have given up their hopes. And Australia also has agreements with different countries. So Australia has an agreement with Indonesia. So it is funding detention camps or setting up of detention camps in Indonesia. Similarly, Canberra has also paid Cambodia around 55 million Australian dollars to set up a camp. So like this, Australia, in the true sense, it doesn't want any of the refugees. The policies actually changed over the years because Australia was historically known as a country of migrants. It was open to migration. Next would be Indonesia's security policy with respect to migration. So Indonesia, along with Australia, is a co-chair to the Bali process. In this country, the security concern is mainly due to connection of migration with trade of drugs, although the drug trade does not involve refugees or asylum seekers. So in this country, securitization of migrants it's been done in a little different way. They're connecting migration to drugs. They say that if migration happens, it's going to facilitate cross-border trade of drugs. So we don't want any of this happening. So in this regard, 14 detention centers have been set up, wherein asylum seekers have been detained. And the worst part about this is that asylum seekers do not have the right to work, which is against international human rights law. So lastly, I would be touching upon the Chinese security policy. China, like Indonesia, is not a signatory or a party to the Refugee Convention or Protocol. Surprisingly, Australia is a signatory to the Refugee Convention and Protocol, but the irony is that although this state has signed the conventions, it is a little reluctant to abide by the principles. So coming back to China. China, again, it's not a signatory. It does not have any national strategy. But China has been transformed from a source country, as in a country which sources migrants, to a country which is receiving migrants, or a destination country. Okay. So more than around 50,000 to 300,000 North Koreans live in China, and North Korea also has a bilateral agreement with China for repatriation of refugees. So this is a picture in Indonesian borders where 6 women were begging for the cause of another woman who was pregnant. So basically these people were coming by boats, and the lady was pregnant on the boat, but they were not allowed to set foot on Indonesian land. So this is the effect of securitization. Okay, so due to paucity of time, I'll just briefly highlight the regional and international stability. So the trend over here is that sovereignty is preferred to human rights. States are reluctant, especially ASEAN states are reluctant to abide by their human rights obligations. And the regional mechanisms which are set up was the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese Refugees in 79-89, and in 2011 the Bali process, and in 2013 the Jakarta Declaration. Next would be dealing with individual human security. It has two complementary elements: freedom from fear, freedom from want, and it has 7 dimensions. So basically, scholars relate all these 7 dimensions with each other. So basically, access to food, water, protection against violence, employment opportunities, along with basic healthcare facilities, all of these come under human security. So scholars securitize human security by dealing with these kind of issues. Vietti and Scribner, so these 2 scholars actually argue that human securitization of individual is basically securitization of human rights. Okay, coming to the critiques. Strategic and human security approaches to migration are problematic because of the potential of reification of migration as a threat. So by approaching migration as a value or a condition, migration becomes a factor in calculation of power and national security. So, and this helps in consolidating migration as a security threat. Resultantly, the definitions of all migrants as threatening prevails and legitimizes exclusionary distinctions, which have become predominant in Europe, North America, and Australasia. Desecuritizing migration, a critical perspective. A different method is required to analyze the migration security nexus. And this would basically analyze the political framing of migration as a threat and the effect it has on public policy as well as public perception. So this is done through analyzing the articulation of discourses, application of technologies, development of legal categories, questions or form filling routines. So basically, as Michel Foucault says, through these kind of mechanisms, people start identifying themselves, they compare themselves with each other, understand the relationship they have with each other. So over here, each other, by the other, we mean the undesirable others who are asylum seekers or refugees or other kind of migrants. So basically, a continuous and intensive circulation of discourses like immigration floods or unwanted or a migrant who has AIDS or HIV, these kind of discourses would legitimize a stronger focus on border control. So basically, I'm just going to take a couple of more minutes. That's it. So what my argument is that these kinds of discourses, technologies, they're present everywhere. And this is drawn from Michel Foucault's argument. So using this argument, I come up with 3 different sites where the domination, subjugation, as well as power knowledge dichotomies exist. Basically, first I deal with how states use discourses to prevent migratory flows. For example, under Operation Sovereign Borders, the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott said, if you want to stop the deaths, if you want to stop the drownings, you have to stop the boats. So this basically was in reference to human security, which is right to life. So this shows that, and the resultant effect was that it's given through the statement in The Guardian, which said that multiculturalism has failed and caused social division and dangerous extremism in Australia, to which 32% of the people endorsed and said yes. So, yeah, these are on a lighter side, this is the policy of Australia depicted in pictographical way. Next site where domination subjugation dichotomy exists is in terms of human trafficking and smuggling. Over here, the role of knowledge to gain power over somebody is manifested. So basically the smugglers or the traffickers have knowledge of the routes which are taken by migrants, and the migrants, on the other hand, they have a variety of push and pull factors which necessitate that they leave their home country. So the victim or the migrant is presented with several discourses wherein he would be offered, or he would be lured into by saying that he would reach the destination very safely. He would be offered discounts or offers or schemes like pay me 50% now, pay me 50% after you reach the destinations. But the problem over here is that if at all the smuggler gets caught on the way to the destination country, he just leaves the boat and he goes away. So in this regard, the knowledge which the victims do not have is acting against them, is acting against their favor. And similarly, in cases of human trafficking, women as well as men are promised, or they are lured into certain kinds of jobs by different professional agencies, and sadly women are trafficked to poor villages or camps for the purpose of sexual exploitation and domestic servitude. And same international matchmaking agencies also do the same. And the same case is prevalent in males who have been forced to work in fishing, the fisheries industry. So the last sites of domination subjugation which I look at is the use of documents, or how documents have been used by states to categorize against the other. Yes, documents are required to recognize who are nationals of your country or not, but when you apply the same thing to a migrant or a refugee or asylum seeker, it doesn't work. So basically a person's traveled for thousands of miles on a boat, fighting for his life, in fear of his life, and after he reaches the border, you ask him for a piece of paper based on which he can either stay or cannot stay. So this basically also acts against the migrant. And in terms of labor or in terms of employment, these papers would basically prevent you from physical abuse, or would ensure that you don't work for long hours. Whereas if you don't have the paper, you need to leave the country. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I understood your point after listening to you. I mean, when you said you are critical about Copenhagen School of theory on securitization, you are not necessarily criticizing the theory itself, right? Yeah. So you are talking about the outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah, out of the theory.
So basically,
so you are basically saying IR scholars are not doing right things.
It's not about right things. I'm saying that because people are caught up in the theory of secularization, they're missing out on a lot of other things.
Yeah, that's.
And these other things have dichotomies of power, knowledge, or domination, subjugation, which we need to address right now.
Okay, yeah, I think that point. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so please make your comments short.
Yes. There'll be three short comments. One on the realist perspective. I think you've been caught up too much in the latest short-term realists aligning with certain political parties and giving certain justification. The long-term realist perspective is the bigger your population is, the bigger your army, the bigger your economy, blah, blah, blah. That's been lost. Like Huntington, who you quote, his previous book was actually about how all the Latin Americans, who are now the greatest evil in America, are their glorious allies in the clash of civilizations against Islam. So there's been a shift there. So the realist. And also, from an Australian perspective, I can't be here from Australia and not clarify what's happening in Australia. First, my New Zealand colleagues would be horrified to hear you refer to Australasia. They are a separate country with distinctly different migration policies from Australia, completely the opposite in regards to refugees. So watch out for that.
Okay.
Two, the situation actually in Australia is last year Australia took in 540,000 migrants, 20,000 of whom were refugees. The reason, yes, which is...
But when they're from Syria,
A lot from Syria, from everywhere. From
Exactly.
all over the world. No. There's no distinction by country in Australia. So 20,000 refugees, 540,000 people from other countries. At the moment, more than 1 in 3, getting close to 40% of everybody currently living in Australia was born in another country. Australia always has been and is now a very high migration country. But if you just look at the news reports, as you have, if you just look at what politicians say, what the cartoonists say, you get the opposite impression. That's because they've demonised the people coming by boat to justify a massive expansion of migration. It used to be 200,000 a year to Australia just a few years ago. It's now 540,000. The reason politically they've got away with that is say, look over here, these particular refugees we're protecting you from. Meanwhile, if you come by aeroplane, with just as good or just as bad rights, you get treated fine. So that's the clarification there. My question, thank you, Soheli, for... Because for me, refugees in Japan is fascinating. Like Australia takes 20,000 a year of refugees and has population then of about 20 million. When I was in Japan, Japan had 120 million. It's probably down to 100, 110 million now, rapidly dropping population. It took 7 refugees that year. I got to meet every single one of them. Yeah. And which is just fascinating because they're so worried about their drop in population. And just recently they've opened up to other labour migration to Japan, albeit short term. One of Abi's 4 arrows is migration. So just I'd like you to comment on whether Japan's economic and strategic needs may lead to a shift in thinking about refugees.
Refugees and migrants are different. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So don't mix them up.
Yeah. So one of my concluding points was that whether reinventing multiculturalism in Japan would benefit Japan in any particular way. So given the demography in Japan currently, which is reducing, and from my understanding in this subject, I believe that if there is a reinvention of what being Japanese means to the society, then perhaps better integration and assimilation of these foreign nationals who are now popularly considering Japan as a destination point. Perhaps then it will prove beneficial not only to Japan, but also in the larger international arena, it will be beneficial to this country.
Okay, one thing, that just a recent, according to my knowledge, there is 1 million immigrants now in Japan. And the official figure is about double, 2 million. And total existing, currently, yeah.
Okay. Sir, here. My question is to the chair directly, because the speaker, Soheli Chatterjee, herself has said that she had not visited Japan. She has not visited Japan, but attempted to write a paper on that. So I want a clarification from you. The exact status of the Japanese policy on immigration, particularly in relation to Taiwan and South Korea.
I don't think any national differences as to the immigration policy. And as I said, I'm an amateur in this field, so I don't have detailed knowledge of that. So as I said, I don't know why I was put in the chair. So I'm not entitled to answer that question, sorry. But if you go through webs, perhaps there should be basic informations. Yeah, sorry, which I don't know. Yeah. Okay, I'll collect 3 questions, and because of time, I'd like to close. Questions? Yeah, please.
Very quickly, actually, the question the panelists can answer if they have the knowledge about it, or the Japanese delegation present here. I would just like to know a little bit more about the disaster-induced displacement that happens, particularly in Japan, and the Fukushima disaster that happened. To my knowledge, I think around 70,000 Japanese were displaced, relocated to somewhere, and some of them have returned. And if anybody, any information about that, what happened in Fukushima and how the disaster-induced displacement is managed today.
Okay, your next.
Thank you, Chair. Sir, I have a question. Why a nation state? When there is a state, nation state, so long they are there, why there is be a compulsion on a nation state to accept refugees permanently? Temporarily, no, I'm not talking about temporarily. Temporarily, they should. They should, on a humanitarian ground. But there should be some authority, I would say UN, who should ultimately take the responsibility to settle the issue. And my objection is, no state is under any compulsion to accept the immigration. It should not be compelled to accept the immigrant, because the issue is very complex. The issue itself is very complex. The different speakers have gone around the aspects. If you go through all that, you find it's a very complex issue. And nations should not be compelled to accept the immigrants. Not at all. Only some authority, I would say UN, should be responsible to accept the responsibility ultimately. What to do with them? Temporarily, yes, they should be given asylum temporarily. Thank you.
Over migration. And
Role of what?
what is the role of the religion over the migration?
Religion.
Yeah. And
In case of Japan?
sorry?
In case of Japan, you mean?
In case of Japan and India.
India.
Yeah.
in
And
general.
second question. Why the people of the Northeast are against the Citizen Amendment Bill 2016?
Okay, so anybody can pick up any question.
I would like to take Sir's question up. So nation states have exclusive rights over their own borders. Nobody compels nation states to accept migrants. It's just a political, what do you say? It's just political in nature. But on the other hand, when you refer to international, public international law, there's a principle of non-refoulement which comes under customary international law, and this is under Article 36 of the International Court of Justice. So basically, under customary law, states they are obliged not to send a migrant back home. It doesn't say anything about receiving a migrant, but once a migrant is in your nation state, you cannot send them back home, especially if they're facing persecution or harm to their physical or mentally. So this would, I suppose, would be an answer to your question.
I said permanently. You're just to be compelled to accept permanently. Yes, that's what you're saying. It's the other way around.
So
you can't compel a person to do something.
Exactly. Even you cannot compel nation states also to
Refuse.
Exactly. No,
I
you.
didn't say refuse. I say accept. But ultimately, it's the responsibility of the United Nations to formulate the law for others to accept it.
Yes, sir. There is a law. There is a customary law, but the law doesn't deal with migrants going inside the country. It just deals with migrants getting out of that country. That's it.
Okay, so would you like to say something? It's a tension between something national and something universal, perhaps, and as a general framework.
I mean, just a general response to your question. When a refugee is seeking rehabilitation in a country which is comparatively, in fact, is in a status of peace and stability, that is all these people are looking forward to when they take immense efforts and immense risk to their lives to travel to a particular nation state. Thereafter, after being granted as you say, a temporary residency permit, I mean, it is, at the end of the day, even temporary residentship is a very vague idea. I mean, a lot of people have been living in certain nation states for over 5 to 6 years, and then suddenly a notice of deportation back to the country where they are, where there are fears of persecution is an extremely I believe as far as humanitarianism isn't concerned, we are failing these migrants. So acceptance is then a kind of a responsibility on a part of these nation states.
And the question. Yeah. Okay. Let us close. Move toward the closing. Impact of religion. In case of Japan, I see no impact element. But the Indian case, I'm not sure. But perhaps you would not get into subject. Debates may flare up. But as the Fukushima case, does any Japanese have any response? My knowledge is, our government approach is basically it's on the basis of individual efforts, and the government would provide some sort of possible supporting, facilitating sort of help, such as building temporary housings for them. But the assumption is they're expected to become independent after spending, a certain period of time. And the kind of harsh aspect of this is this period is set. And after 2, 3, 4 years, after the set number of years, they have to leave those houses. So they have to be self-sufficient during those years when help is being provided. So that's the kind of basic assumption approach of our government sort of policies about these disasters. And we have lots of disasters, the volcanoes in Kyushu, and so we cannot move. And my theory is a series of those disasters in the long history of our nation created our national character to put up with those difficulties, on your own, rather than blaming others or rather than blaming the government. A Korean good friend of mine once told me, why people, after suffering from those earthquakes, are so quiet, and why they don't rally in front of the Prime Minister's office and protest the government and so forth. And so Koreans say that because Korea blames the government for almost anything, and but the Japanese don't do that. They just take it as their personal kind of difficulty. And I think this national character was created through this long history of having continued to suffer from natural disasters, typhoons, volcanoes, and earthquakes, about which individuals cannot do anything. And well, I may be right or wrong, I don't know. But the last comment to your presentation was, I think you started from Edo period, so that's very indicative of the nature of your research, which is to talk about some of the factors which work against the sort of universal things of norms and so forth in dealing with these immigrant issues. But as I said, this is a friction between something national and something universal, and the way these two, somewhat contradictory things would evolve, of course, it changes over time, and so I think in doing this, as a Japanese, I sincerely hope you would also look at changes which have happened, in Japan, and also some of the things. For instance, foreign immigrants in Japan which got permanent status. They have all kinds of rights except political rights. They have a right of insurance, they have right of pensions, and almost every right. And so, but the political rights are very much limited, very, very, very strictly, and that's the focus of criticism. Often the case when people say, for foreigners living in Japan do not get equal rights, to the Japanese. And so maybe there is some context in which these things should be interpreted and discussed. That's my general comment to your thing. And so, did you want to say something? 30 seconds? Nothing? Okay. So thank you very much. Sorry, I extended almost 15 minutes, but I think very, very good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. We are moving into the last session. I invite Paras and Vivek. Good afternoon. We are in the final session, and in this session we will be talking about what are the next steps that need to be taken in Indo-Pacific in terms of its security architecture, economic interactions, and other social interactions as well. We have two good scholars, Vivek Vishra and Paras Ratna, who will be talking about the generally focusing on Quad and what are the next steps that need to be taken there. While Mr. Ratna is uploading his PPT, may I ask Dr. Vivek to take the stage.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, I'm really privileged to be here, especially all the three organizing bodies, and in particular, Mr. Polipaka was been kind enough to extend the invitation. I'd be talking about giving purpose to Quad. First, next steps to its building an expansive regional security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. Now, of course, the greater emphasis in the second part of my paper will be on India. Now, the resurrection of Quad itself has been linked to the informal talks that sort of and consultations of November 2017, and all of us know that. And that certainly raised kind of expectation in the region of the possibility of a greater strategic alignment between the four members of the Quad. Now, the Quad's resurgence is certainly notable, especially considering the convergence of all the four members in some aspects to their individual and combined regional approaches to the Indo-Pacific region. Now, as such, we would all agree that Quad is fundamentally linked to the idea of the Indo-Pacific. Now, the question that really comes to my mind are really two-pronged. One is, how can really Quad move forward beyond the conceptual consensus to substantive actions? In other words, will the members of Quad be operating as a dialogue mechanism, or will they take certain concrete steps in terms of actions, be it economic or security related? High on symbolism, no action is the distinction that I want to draw here. And the second question is whether we can see Quad potentially emerge in the whole region as a security architecture with combining the apparatuses from all the countries who are members. Now, when the Quad members met in 2017, there was certainly a new kind of enthusiasm with the Quad 2.0 and similar sentiments, and especially, the question whether four countries can combine their security apparatuses in the region in terms of security in the near future. Now, these expectations were certainly riding on a series of events that I don't need to highlight, reflecting growing assertiveness of China across from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. Now, but considering concrete deliverables, the Quad as an organization has depicted, to my mind, a little purpose due to lack of resolve and commitment from all the members. And a closer look at the compulsions of the Quad members, to my mind, of course, reflects that each nation in Quad would, each of its members faces a dilemma at certain level, at various levels. One or more essential grounds that would require for a substantive and a robust security architecture. The U.S., for instance, the Trump administration has taken up the whole issue in the NSS, the National Security Strategy, but the forthcoming steps after that have been really hollow, so to say. Now, Japan, Australia, and India, of course, we have all the three countries also face dilemmas at various levels in terms of combining their security apparatus, per se. But one of the main dichotomies that docks this organization, Quad, is that while members have individually pledged to support an open and an inclusive sort of rule-based order in the region, the group itself has not been, the voice itself has not been formalized at the ministerial level, and we all know that, and this leads certainly to some lightweight promises of the regional cohesion that we talk about through Quad. Now, let me move to India specifically. In recent discourse, of course, on on the Indo-Pacific, India has been portrayed as the weakest link, and that's certainly the strand of thought emerges from the Western writings, primarily owing to its unwillingness to be a part of the conception of Quad that rides on a countervailing China-centric security regional partnership. And although the lack of organizational cohesion in the Quad cannot be attributed to one member, in my view, India certainly stands out in its distinct understanding of the Indo-Pacific from the rest of the Quad members. And for India, one of the key challenges will be to move beyond certain reservations that it has about a more formalized structure of the Quad and increase, of course, tangible cooperations with the United States and other members, and Japan and other members. And, of course, at the same time, avoid alignments. That will be the balance that India seeks in being a member of the Quad. Now, that brings me to two decisive factors of India's policies in the Indo-Pacific, which have sort of, in my view, greatly impinge on India's idea of the Indo-Pacific. First is decoupling. Now, India has constantly emphasized on the decoupling of the idea of the Quad from its conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific, right? And this has been understood by quite a number of people, including Indian ambassadors like Pankaj Saran and others. Of course, this has been highlighted. But this, to me, it appears as a structural policy demarcation in the Indo-Pacific between the two things. Now, the idea of decoupling the Quad from the Indo-Pacific is against the very grain of a strategic continuum that the whole idea of Indo-Pacific seeks. Now, essentially, if you ask a question to yourself, why does India, why did India decide to become a part of the Quad? The consistent answer that at least I get is because it seeks a regionally stable strategic continuum. So there is that dichotomy, in the Indo-Pacific, between the Indo-Pacific and the Quad in India's understanding. And this stands out, especially as opposed to a vision which is a disrupted vision of the region. So in that sense, I really talk about a strategic continuum. Now, the Quad's place in the current patchwork of various bilaterals, minilaterals, and multilateral security arrangements in the Indo-Pacific is therefore, to my mind, not defined right now. So while India probably wouldn't pitch for a hard power-oriented security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, it has to factor the need of a regional security architecture to sustain its future goals in the Indo-Pacific and also its aspirations, and also beyond the Indo-Pacific in the forthcoming times. Importantly, this can be done without vigorous militarization of the Quad, and this is where I think India has an important benefit to be a part of the Quad, and also at the same time avoid aligned partnerships with countries that it doesn't want to. Now, the second factor, moving on from decoupling, is the idea of inclusivity. Now, India places the highest premium on the word inclusive in the whole inclusive, free and open, rule-based order in the Quad discourse. Certainly, it places more emphasis on the inclusivity than other members of the Quad. And this was emphasized by Prime Minister in his Shangri-La speech and have been persistently figuring in various writings across. Now, first, the question that comes to my mind is, what are the limits of India's use of the word inclusive? Inclusive to what extent, right? And if India's presumptive state behavior and China's steps in the Indo-Pacific are any trend to go by, then, of course, inclusivity in the Indo-Pacific is without China, for India, because China is the main disruptor, as we say. Now, but in our state discourse in India, we haven't really drawn a clear line of expectation vis-a-vis China, and I think that's a little problematic, certainly in the Indo-Pacific. And also, India hasn't officially denied whether China's inclusion in the concept of the Indo-Pacific is a thing in real. So, also the Quad's three major members have conceptualized the inclusion of New Zealand, South Korea, at least the United States and Japan and Australia have. Where does India stand on that? The expansion of Quad, if it were a reality in the future. So lack of clarity on all these, grounds further compound the Quad's inability to deliver as a unit. And hence, I argue the need of a structured response to the region. Now, the Quad concept, if developed structurally, I believe will be the best hope for a peaceful balance of power in Asia, keeping in check great power rivalry, and opening way for also economic cooperation and so forth. So that brings me to some prescriptions that I think are in order. Now, firstly, it is important to sort of underline what Quad should not do. It certainly should not be an expansive regional order looking on issues like climate change, regional trade groupings, and so forth. Secondly, Quad could focus. What the Quad could focus is on building a expansive maritime infrastructure in the whole Indo-Pacific region. The third consideration for Quad is the need for elevating the partnership to include Australia. And I think we've heard various discourses in the newspapers recently that, and I quote ad verbatim, the time is not ripe for Australia. I think the time is right for Australia to join the Quad. And importantly, India has to view the inclusion of Australia not from an alternative security architecture discourse rather than a presumptive anti-China sort of grouping. And I think that will solve much of the problem. And also, the fourth thing is that India's inclusion in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, will be an important step towards mainstreaming the shared vision that connects the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And the fifth is that there has to be a graded response, an approach to Quad as a sustained security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, the promotion of trilaterals mechanisms would be an important consideration, and it has been highlighted in the previous talk. And this could allow India to expand the Quad countries' goals to the Indian Ocean region and also gaining an understanding and appreciation of the objectives in the Pacific. Now, if some of these prescriptions were to be carried out, the Quad is likely to provide a structural comprehension and an avenue of integrating the larger South Asian region into the Asia-Pacific. I'll end with a final thought on India's position on the Quad. Is India's employment of the subtlety and nuance in the Indo-Pacific driven by necessity or choice? To my mind, both. Whatever strategy India pursues in the Indo-Pacific, there's no substitute for naval power. And I think the backbone for any strategy or strategy of choice in the Indo-Pacific will be, is a bolstered naval power. So without this, subtlety sort of isn't really persuasive to my mind. And lastly, the next steps in the Quad will significantly depend on the next steps that China takes in the region. I think I'll stop here and wait for the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. Paras, go ahead.
Hello. I would like to thank Sanjay Pulipaka sir and Sakti Sinha ji and Japan Foundation for giving me an opportunity to present. Thanks a lot. Yeah. So I'm presenting the dynamics of Quad in the Indo-Pacific, realizing the potential. Basically, Quad is a structural necessity. It failed in 2007, but again came back in 2017. So debating on whys of Quad doesn't make sense now because it is a structural necessity which is necessary to manage the transition power. Yeah. Okay. Fine now? Yeah. So idea of Quad, as people know, was initially by Japanese PM Shinzo Abe in his book Kunie, A Beautiful Country. Then it failed out in 2007 because Australian PM Kevin Rudd apparently backed out, and which is till now makes India think Australia is not dependable enough. But it was again back in 2017 with US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson pitching for greater engagement among democratic powers. So push factor here being increasing assertiveness of China and threat to open sea lines of communication, which is vital for the interest needs of all participating countries, including Australia. Thus, Quad has become a structural necessity in managing the power transition in Asia. So also when we look at Quad, we need to look at from the ideals and interest perspective. It is we also look at the values dimensions which drive the Quad, which forms an important constituent of statecraft. For example, in the words of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Commander Admiral Phil Davidson, Admiral Phil Davidson. Quad is initially being conceptualized free from coercion by other nations. Individual rights and liberties, including religious freedom and good governance, is prioritized. The shared values of United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All nations should enjoy unfettered access to the seas and airways upon which our nations and economies depend. Open investment environments, transparent agreement between nations, protection of intellectual property rights, fair and reciprocal trade. The same more or less was also reiterated by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Shangri-La dialogue when he pitched for an inclusive Quad. Now, realizing the potential of Quad, so shared values play a crucial role in statecraft, but it is not sufficient. Therefore, tangible manifestation is needed for Quad to be credible. What are the avenues which Quad can collaborate upon? One such avenue is cyber security. Cyber security affects both the western reaches of the Quad as well as the eastern reaches of the Indo-Pacific. Digitization as a double-edged sword which present opportunities plus challenges. ASEAN, East Africa, India, Australia, Japan and US is increasingly facing the challenge of cyber security and cyber espionage. According to reports, ASEAN companies are exposed to risks of $750 billion, while East Africa lost $3.5 billion in 2017 compared to $2 billion in 2016. Top 10 countries which faces most cyber security risk: US 303, India 133, Japan 87, Taiwan 59, Ukraine 49, South Korea 45, Brunei 34, Russia 32, Vietnam 29 and Pakistan 22. Sector-wise cyber attack in Southeast Asia, 27% attack was made on the government sector, followed by transportation. Here, the FireEye is a platform which works for providing cyber security, and it is explicitly mentioned in its report that hacker tried to steal information pertaining to South China Sea when they attacked the government and the transportation website. These are network readiness index ranking. Network readiness is by World Economic Forum, which says how better is a country positioned to leverage its ICT, information and communication technology. So we can see that there is a huge intra-regional difference in the Indo-Pacific region, with Singapore ranking 1, with Japan ranking 10, India 91, US 5, Australia 18, and East and African countries further to 126, 120, 119. So this necessitates a collaboration on the part of Quad countries. Well, again, one thing that is mentioned, that is worth noting here is that 90% cyber attacks are for intelligence gathering. Also, between 2012 to 2017, confidential data on the IT network of Chinese-built African Union headquarters was siphoned to Shanghai. So this becomes important at times when China is increasingly being involved in infrastructural projects across India, across the Indo-Pacific region. So this siphoning of data becomes crucial for Quad countries to contemplate upon. Similarly, Kenya's major cybercrime raid in 2014 led to the arrest of 77 foreigners, of which 76 were Chinese national. So that also needs to be contemplated upon. Countries like Malaysia, Indonesia and Vietnam are global hotspot for blocked suspicious web activities, which is 3.5 times the normal standard. Kenya and Tanzania, Nigeria lost huge amount of money and their banking IT systems are at huge risk. So this becomes an important avenue for Quad countries to collaborate, especially countries like US, India and Japan, which has tremendous IT infrastructure in place. So I propose setting up a Indo-Pacific Convention on Cyber Security and Personal Data Protection that should involve all stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific littorals. Next is infrastructure financing. Sustainable and transparent infrastructure financing is another thrust area where Quad countries can cooperate. Chinese Development Bank and Exim Bank have already sold out $200 billion in loans through Asia, Middle East and Africa. But what is the problem? High interest rate plus opaque terms and conditions. Debt trap leading to seizure of strategic assets by Chinese firm. Example, Hambantota in Sri Lanka and quite recently Mombasa port in Kenya too faces the same risk. Chinese interest rate for Sri Lanka was 6.3% per annum, while Asian Development Bank and World Bank loan charges 0.25% to 3% per annum, whereas India's line of credit for interest rate is around 1% per annum. China charged Philippines an interest rate of 2% to 3% per annum, while that of Japan lies between 0.25% to 0.75%, up to 12 times cheaper. What is the result? Backlash against Chinese government, with Chinese investment, with successive government reviewing Chinese terms and conditions, including Pakistan. Harvard's Balfour Center carried out a study assessing vulnerability of countries from Asia and Africa to Chinese debt trap. This is very important when to analyze for Quad countries. Pakistan, it ranges from 1 to 5, where 1 is lowest, 5 is highest. Pakistan is 4.3, Djibouti is 3.9, Sri Lanka is 3.8, Malaysia 3.4, Thailand 2.1, Laos PDR 3.4, Cambodia 3.2, Philippines 3, Myanmar 3.42, Kenya 2. It is important to note that India's immediate neighborhood, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, are vulnerable. Thank you. Quad grouping should therefore consider joint infrastructure projects. Initiatives like AAGC, US, Japan, US trilaterally already underway, but they are yet to take off in a big way. Therefore, Quad countries could mull setting up an Indo-Pacific infrastructure investment bank to promote sustainable and transparent infrastructure financing in the region. Now, piracy is another challenge when it comes to Indo-Pacific region, including Australia faces huge challenge due to piracy. Western stretch of Indian Ocean, western part of Indo-Pacific saw a hike in risk score from 2.4 to 2.8, which will lead to additional insurance cost. Whereas eastern stretch of Indo-Pacific saw 1,908 seafarers being exported to 2017. Therefore, the momentum is already there. What is needed now is greater synergy between the Quad countries. Japan has already deployed Huga class helicopter for maritime surveillance and destroyers like JZ, Suzunami and JS Fuyukuji in the Indian Ocean region. US Navy has already, Central Command has sanitized the corridor of Gulf of Aden known as International Recommended Transit Corridor, and India has already put a naval attaché in its Central Command. In addition, US has a permanent bases in South Korea and Japan, and US plan to deploy 60% surface ships in Indo-Pacific region. India has also signed logistic agreement with countries like US, and the talks are underway with Japan. It conducts annual Manaval exercise where its stealth frigate INS Sahyadri and anti-submarine INS Kamarota and fleet tanker INS Sakti were sent in the previous round to take part in joint naval exercise. Milan is another exercise where the purpose is to create a common platform for in the Indo-Pacific region to promote dialogue and cooperation. Australia has also shown a keen interest in the Indo-Pacific. It carries the largest exercise, Indo-Pacific Endeavour, for 2 years in a row. The exercise has twofold objective ranging from projecting humanitarianism and maintaining stability. By the way, Australia has also deployed its frigates, HAMS Adelaide, which is Australia's most potent warship, and it is reportedly believed to be the Australia's largest deployment since 1980s. Quad countries could collaborate in further in these four-way maritime situational awareness. Indian Navy recently inaugurated Information Fusion Center, which could act as a nodal point for the countries in Indo-Pacific region to exchange maritime information. Again, safeguarding exclusive economic zones. Fishing militias is another problem which confronts relatively weaker ASEAN states. So Quad could be a platform where they can build the maritime capacity of the ASEAN states in confronting those challenges. Another thing is the role of European powers in France and UK could also be explored. For example, Indian sailor Abhilash Tomy, which got lost, was founded by a French vessel. So this European power should also be factored into the picture of Indo-Pacific. The Quad could be an anchor of ASEAN centrality. It could provide a diplomatic platform for advocating international law and could coordinate with weaker ASEAN states in firmly voicing out their concerns regarding any assertive behavior, which in bilateral negotiations with China becomes difficult. Thus, Quad and ASEAN has potential to complement against each other in contrast of general perception of it undermining ASEAN centrality. Challenges to Quad. Now, this is important. First is the differences in geographical definition. USA says it's Hollywood to Bollywood, while for India it's east coast of Africa to the source of Pacific. In my view, these are mostly operational differences in perception, and which could be ironed out, which was shown by the recent logistic exchange memorandum of agreement signed between India and USA. Reticent behavior of participating members in Australia not dependable. In this case, I would like to suggest that Indian Air Force has engaged with Australia's Pitch Black exercise, which is Royal Australian Air Force biennial exercise. Also, INS Sahyadri participated in Kakadu exercise, which is regional maritime multilateral exercise 2018. And plus, Australia and India is already having a naval exercise called OS Index. Thus, which illustrates India's readiness for regional military collaboration with Australia, which is often overlooked. Is Quad a return of Cold War in Asia? Evidence points to the contrary. Major Asian powers like China, Japan and India are continuously engaging with each other, driven by economic logic, and therefore it is not a zero-sum game. At best, Quad is an instrument to navigate the political flux in an increasingly non-polar world. Thank you.
Good one, Ratna. We had We had two very good presentations. Dr. Mishra looked at the larger security architecture that needs to be thought through when we are thinking of Quad and Indo-Pacific. And we had Paras Ratna talking about what are the specific areas of cooperation that Quad countries can indulge in or cooperate with each other. He has listed out various things ranging from cyber security to anti-piracy. My question to Dr. Mishra would be where Mr. Paras left. Are we entering a new Cold War? And while you think about it, I can take a bunch of questions. Any questions, please? I'll take about 3 questions and then, yes.
It's me, Lyson Mlakisan. How Japan became the peace, progress, prosperity country after World War II?
Any other questions?
What was the question?
Yeah, Professor Soeya.
Yeah, the merit of Quad is, I think, there are 2 different merits. One is U.S. involvement, and the other is trilateral thing among India, Japan, Australia. And if Japan, Australia, India meet as a side event of this Quad, are they going to talk about the same thing as the formula where U.S. is involved, or could be somewhat different?
As brief as possible. Thank you, sir. We've been talking in terms of Indo-Pacific. China has been there all the time. China. Why China is there? There must be a vacuum that they are filling. Why we created the vacuum? And if there's no vacuum, let us create a vacuum and fill it. Thank you.
Inclusiveness. Can you define what actually inclusiveness means? Is it just inviting everyone sitting at the table and talking, or is it about the infrastructure that you are taking, inviting all to participate? And it is not all inclusive, only inclusive.
Yeah, sorry, just same thing. Yeah, you said inclusiveness doesn't include China, right? So I want you to clarify a little bit on that.
Okay. I'll go in the reverse order. Thank you for the questions. Inclusiveness. Now, it's a very important underlying point of the whole idea and the conception of Indo-Pacific and the Quad by India. Now, precisely why I pointed out inclusive to what extent. Now, officially, India hasn't said that China is not a part of its Indo-Pacific policy. That really makes it, but the state discourse and the state behavior certainly suggests that China is not a part of Indo-Pacific. So there's a dichotomy there, right? And India has, to my mind, purposefully left it like that because currently it suits its national interest to hedge on both sides, right? And it could be a matter of debate whether it's beneficial in the longer term as a foreign policy, but certainly right now it's that the whole inclusive phrase has been left there purposefully to be able to work on either sides, to my mind. Power vacuum. I think I don't think Southeast Asia was ever a power vacuum after the World War II. I mean, or even before. But because power vacuum theories are generally, if you talk of the Indian Ocean, just a digression, people have written about power vacuum and so forth, that there was, after the British withdrew from the east of Suez after 1967 or 63, then there was a power vacuum and then the United States came and filled in. But actually research shows that there was a clear-cut coordination between the British and the American forces, and there was never a power vacuum. I'm sure there are in the room better minds to tell you about South Asia, but power vacuum as a theory is really not strong to my mind in Southeast Asia. Coming back to your question, sir, when the trilaterals meet, do they actually talk about other issues? Certainly. Look at G20. People have talked about everything on sidelines of G20. So why not trilaterals? I think JAI, for example, Japan, America, and India, they would certainly bring Quad up and iron out the issues. So to my mind, I think, yes, trilaterals are much more than, on the sidelines are much more than trilaterals. It's just trilateral issues. How Japan became a power, a peace-loving country after the World War. There are great people who could tell you the whole story, but it's an entire story that we can talk about during the lunch. But are we entering a Cold War, sir? Yes and no. I mean, it certainly doesn't go to the extent of militarization, to my mind, but it stops just before militarization. But this tussle is certainly going to go on. And if you can call it Cold War or cold confrontation, as some people call it, I think, yes, we are entering that phase. Thank you.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah.
Dean.
Thank you, Vivek. The question is directed to you. And you raised a very interesting point about, the specific issues that the Indo-Pacific should not get involved into. And you mentioned the issue of climate change in it. I get your reasons. I mean, it's a global issue. And, maybe the countries would not like to. And there are already existing platforms that are working towards it. So I get it. But since I am looking at the nuclear issues, I am very intrigued to know as to what are your thoughts on, let's say there is a hypothetical nuclear crisis within the Indo-Pacific region, and there are presently certain nuclear issues that are going on, and we know North Korea is a proliferation problem for us, and many years of diplomacy has not really worked. So let's fast forward to hypothetical situations. 20 years down the line, you have a severe nuclear crisis in the region. And would you not have Quad countries to actually, play a kind of diplomatic role in it? Because Australia has strong non-proliferation commitments. India has, since 2005 onwards, emerged out as a responsible non-proliferation, state, and we are advancing our goals in that objective. Then there is US that the American interest ties directly into resolving the nuclear dilemma, and so is Japan. So all these four countries kind of stands out. And when you look at talking about Quad as a security architecture or in some sort of security architecture shaping up in the near future, yes, I agree. Militarily going out all there and having these robust sort of maybe unnecessary narratives on the military front may not be very necessary. But when you talk about the utility of Quad in as a diplomatic platform and really some sort of usability in resolving crisis, I think Quad can play a very interesting role.
Certainly. I'll agree with you and sort of not agree with you. But, if you look at Quad, we've not even taken the first step. So at this stage, to my mind, it shouldn't be an expansive regional agenda because it is sure to fizzle out. But as you grow up, as I talked about the possible expansion of Quad in the near future to include South Korea and New Zealand and other players, also Vietnam, who knows. Now, if that really happens, then it's very becoming of the organization to take up issues like nuclear proliferation, which concerns the central idea of the Asia-Pacific and now the Indo-Pacific. So I certainly agree with you that in the near future we should certainly take up, but as and when we get taking the first step, I don't think a huge, large agenda of the organization, a small organization which hasn't been able to gather itself till now, that sort of will be a huge challenge for the organization. So, yeah.
Very good. Don't ask whether
So what is the role of the Muslim and the communist state in the peace, prosperity, and progress in 21st century? Every Muslim is not...
This has got nothing to do with what we just talked about.
Okay.
Sorry, Chair, that one's out of order. It has nothing to do with the topic.
We will... Thank you. Paras, last question to you. You gave a large menu of things that Quad should do, but how do you propose to... how does Quad propose to achieve all these things? What kind of meetings or institutional structure do you conceptualize?
So, for example, Quad currently has a joint secretary level meeting. Probably we can upgrade it to some ministerial level meeting that would give us that would also give a more expression of seriousness, that would also come out as an expression of seriousness, and it would be taken more seriously than the currently joint secretary level meetings. So yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir. Sorry to butt in at this moment. Quad today lacks institutional infrastructure, right? Is it because of ignorance or a conscious decision not to formalize it to a point? So you need a certain amount of ambiguity to avoid a new Cold War in a very formal sense. You don't want a NATO versus a Warsaw Pact. So is by Quad not having an institutional mechanism, is it Quad's weakness or is it Quad's strength? I think that is the point that one must, instead of rushing into it,
On the organizational level, I think it's certainly a weakness. But on the individual levels, I think this strategic hedging certainly helps India, specifically. Other countries, United States it certainly doesn't help because it's waning in the Asia-Pacific, and it would want to have a concrete, robust mechanism in the region. But to a country like India, I think, so there are two distinctions. One is that at the organizational level, I think certainly lack of a structure is a weakness. But at the individual level, I think it cuts both ways, I would say. Yeah.
I promise to be very quick. A lot of talk hypothetically about where the Quad can build its structures in the future. So hypothetically thinking the other way, if tomorrow the Quad, all these structures cease to exist, where do you see things happening if there never had been a Quad and there isn't in the future, if there isn't this sort of cooperation?
I think Japan, if really a disruption of that sort were to happen, I think I see India emerging as a distinct figure without any association with the Pacific in the Indian Ocean region. Other countries, Australia, I'm still not sure. But United States will be where it is and probably even, on its way to the wane gradually. Japan will be as neutral as it has been in the post-Cold War. So I think that's how, to my mind, it figures out. Thank you.
Thank you. We are already 5 minutes behind schedule, and it has been a 2-day intense conversations on Indo-Pacific. My thanks to all the speakers and participants who are here. As a member of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, someone who is associated with it, I'm absolutely delighted that we hosted this event. I'm thankful to Shri Shakti Sinha for all his encouragement and support that he always gives. And I'm also thankful to my colleagues who are constantly supporting us in all our activities, whether it is Iqbal Ahmed or Rajneesh or all other people. I shouldn't take names. All of them have supported us exceptionally well. Generally, when you are doing some major event, there should be some major power cut. You should be sitting in darkness, or the PowerPoint projector should not work, or something like that should happen. But for the last 2 days, everything went off without a glitch. That tells you how much hard work the NMML staff have constantly putting in. Without a glitch, the event went off really well. The event has been live streamed on Facebook and other social media platforms. The video is available on the YouTube, and you can and on our website. So you may feel free to share it with your colleagues and friends, and speakers may have a look at it to strengthen their arguments even further. I would also like to thank Saranya, who is here, who has been communicating with all of you, constantly harassing you for abstracts, photographs, and all those things. I would also like to thank Japan Foundation for their constant support, and always a pleasure working with you. And we look forward to even more stronger relationship, and we can continue this conversation on how to take this collaboration forward. And lastly, we are heading to dinner. Some of the panelists, speakers, delegates have flights to catch, so they will be the first ones to take lunch, and then of course all of us will join together, and of course all of us will have lunch together. And thanks again, for all the participants.